Okay, I'm going to show you how to install an intake manifold, how to position the gaskets, and what you got to do if you're resealing one. My application, these back cork pieces, I RTV'd into place. I did that yesterday. So if you're going to use RTV, which would be the only sealer I'd recommend for gluing these into place, because if you use like a high tack, it stays slippery and it'll slide out when you're trying to put it in place. Use the RTV the day before, let it cure overnight so that it's in place, and when you go to position the intake manifold on there, it doesn't fall off. On each of these corners, a little tab in the head, get down here close, that the intake manifold gasket has to line with, and there's also a tab on the side here that lines up to the intake. You see that brown stuff on there? That is a high tack sealer that I'm using just to around the water ports as a second layer of protection. You can see why I replaced it. I had engine oil leaking down the bell housing, making a mess. What happens is these cork gaskets get really hard over time. Got a couple here still in the bag. They're just made out of cork, and eventually over time the rubber loses its compression and it turns hard like a rock, and then oil will start to splash and run out. So, you know, if you got an intake leaking, this is a 351 Windsor Ford, you want to replace those gaskets, you got to pull the intake off. So the most important thing about when you get an intake off is your prep work. Make sure everything is clean. I usually wipe everything down with isopropyl alcohol. After I scrape it, I take a vacuum cleaner and suck up anything that might have fallen down. Stuff paper towels into the intake port so you don't have debris falling down inside the engine while you're cleaning up and doing your prep work. Just something to keep in mind. I did take the time to clean up my intake manifold. I took it to the car wash, degreased it, power washed it, came back, scraped it, cleaned it up, and repainted it so it looked nice. One of the issues that you might have problems with are lifting it into place because it's cast iron. I made a couple of T-handles that screw into some threads on the top of the intake, just so I'd have a couple of handles to hold on to lift it into place. This will make it a lot easier to handle. Screw the other one in over here. And now I've got two handles to handle this thing with to set it into place. Otherwise, you're trying to hold on the front and the back and set it down at the same time. Very difficult to do. Two handles should make it super easy to do. Now comes the fun of setting the manifold into place. Got my gaskets ready. Got my T-handles on my manifold. This thing is heavy, so it'll test the strongest of you to try to put it in there. I did lift it out the other side. Maybe that would be better. Let's give it a whirl from here. Sometimes having a buddy to help you might be a better option too. Yeah, got about 50 pounds intake manifold. I'll lean over, my feet are going to come off the ground. Navigate around the distributor, the fuel line, everything else that's getting put on. Okay, back end's down. Front end's coming into place. I'm getting close, but I still need to pick it up and move it forward. I believe I'm in place, relatively close there, right about there, looks good. Okay, let's see if my holes line up. Beautiful on this side. Let's see about the other side. Looks like we're good there too. All right, put the bolts in, then we'll torque it down. Okay, with intake manifold being kind of a wedge shaped, you have to have a torque sequence. Right here is my torque sequence chart, so I'm going to follow that as I tighten it down. To start out, I need to snug them all up, and I'm going to use a nice little short ratchet to do that with so I don't over tighten it. That way it pulls it down kind of straight. My torque is 23 to 25 foot-pounds, so I'm going to go ahead and snug it down. And one of the things I would really recommend is that you clean up your bolts really good and look at them. You know, if you got bolts that are stretched or look damaged or corroded, strongly consider replacing those, because you don't need any intake bolts breaking off when you're trying to tighten up stuff. Right now I'm just taking the slack out of them, and then I'll proceed with the tightening. Let's get all the bolts kind of shortened up here. These are always kind of a challenge because you don't got a whole lot of room to work with. Get stuff out of the way, it makes it a whole lot easier though. Now, one of the things that the documentation says is take off the distributor. I didn't need to, so I didn't see any point in doing that, because then you have to reset your timing. And why take an extra step if you don't need to? Maybe a situation where you have to take it off. One of the advantages of taking it off is that you can set the manifold straight down versus trying to lift it up and move it into position. The other thing is, you've got to remember, you got a 50-pound intake manifold, and setting that into position regardless of whether there's a distributor there or not can be a challenge. If the threads are kind of rusty, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to bust out the tap and clean all the threads out on the heads where they screw in, because it'll just make it that much easier to retorque it. I was pretty lucky, all my threads seemed pretty clean, so it wasn't much of a chore to get everything started and tightened up. This back guy's tight. Following my torque sequence, I'm going to start snugging these down. So, let's see, front of the engine is that way. Number one's going to be this guy. Snug it. Number 2, snug it. Number 3, snug it. Number 4. If you don't follow a torque sequence or a tightening sequence, you could wind up with a vacuum leak or a water leak, because one corner was loose or one corner was too tight, and it created a gap because the intake didn't go down straight. Okay. Number 8. Is right here. Number 13. I don't don't see a 13 and 14. It should be right here, but it does not show it. Okay. Must be a difference between a new one and an old one. I don't have 13, 14, 15, or 16. So we can skip those. So let's go back to 1. And it's loose again. 1, 2, 3. There's 4. There's 5. There's 6. And then 7. 8, 9, 10, 11, and then 12. Okay. Next is going to be getting a torque wrench out and torquing those to specification. This one says 23 to 25. So I'll go over them one more time with the short ratchet, and I'll get out my torque wrench and tighten it up. Follow my torque sequence. I've got my torque wrench set at 25 foot-pounds. Start with number 1. There's 1, 2. Number 2. Number 3. Number 4. Okay, number 5 up front here. Okay, number 6 up front over here. Number 7. Number 8. And then just run over them one more time, just to be sure everything is up to spec. Okay, good, good, good. Okay, number 5. Okay, everything's good, everything's tight. I just got to put it back together.